The German guard spat on the frozen ground 3 inches from Elijah Greer's face and said, in rapid German, "Look at this one. Black as coal. They send us animals now. These creatures understand nothing. We could tell them we were taking them to be shot, and they would simply smile." Elijah did not move. He kept his eyes on the ice-crusted dirt, his breath forming small clouds in the December air. But inside his mind, he filed away every word. The cattle car had carried them for 2 days through the frozen heart of Germany. 47 American soldiers crammed into a space meant for livestock, with no food, no water, and a single bucket for waste. Elijah was one of 11 black soldiers captured during the chaos of the Battle of the Bulge, when German forces smashed through Allied lines in the Ardennes forest and his artillery battalion was overrun. He had watched friends die in the snow. He had raised his hands in surrender only when his rifle clicked empty and a German tank rolled close enough for him to see the driver's eyes. Now he lay face down on frozen German soil, surrounded by guards who believed he was less than human. They did not know about his grandmother. They did not know about the 30 years she had spent working for a German-American family in Cincinnati, learning their language so well that she read Goethe and Schiller for pleasure. They did not know that she had raised Elijah on German fairy tales spoken in the original tongue, that his first lullabies were songs from Bavaria, that he dreamed sometimes in a language that belonged to these men who now kicked him toward the processing line. The camp was called Stalag 9B, near the town of Bad Orb in Hesse. Elijah had heard of such places, prisoner of war camps where the Geneva Convention was supposed to protect captured soldiers. But as the guards shoved the black prisoners into a separate line from the white Americans, he understood that conventions meant little when the enemy saw you as subhuman. The registration officer barely looked at Elijah before stamping his papers. "Labor detail," the officer said in German to his assistant. "Put the Schwarzen on coal and latrine duty. They are built for such work." Elijah kept his face blank. He shuffled forward when ordered. He answered questions in broken English, playing the role they expected, the ignorant American Negro who could barely read his own name. Inside, his mind was racing. That first night, crammed into a barracks that reeked of mold and unwashed bodies, Elijah listened. Guards stood outside, smoking cigarettes and complaining about supply shortages. One mentioned that a convoy of food had been redirected to the Eastern Front. Another worried aloud about the approaching Americans. The guards knew the war was turning. Even if they could not say so publicly why the third day, Elijah had learned more about the camp's operations than any American officer. He knew which guards were true believers and which were tired old men counting days until the war ended. He knew that the Red Cross had not visited in 2 months. He knew that the commandant was hiding something from Berlin on the 4th day. He took a risk. Captain William Davenport was a senior American officer in their compound, a thin man from Virginia with a voice that carried the accent of old money and older prejudices. He had barely acknowledged the black prisoners since their arrival. But when Elijah approached him during the evening meal, speaking low and fast, Davenport's expression shifted from annoyance to disbelief. "They're planning a transfer," Elijah said. "A labor camp somewhere east. They mentioned it this morning. And the commandant has been hiding sick prisoners from inspection teams. There's a building behind the East Block where they keep men too weak to stand." Davenport stared at him. "How do you know this?" "I speak German, sir. Fluently. They talk in front of me because they think I'm too stupid to understand." For a long moment, Davenport said nothing. Elijah could see the war happening behind the captain's eyes. The prejudices of a Virginia upbringing fighting against the cold mathematics of survival. They were prisoners. Information was power. And this black private had just offered him a weapon the Germans would never expect. "How many of them know?" Davenport finally asked. "None of them, sir. Not one." Davenport nodded slowly. "Keep it that way. And keep listening." Elijah returned to his bunk that night with his heart pounding. He had just become something more than a prisoner. He had become a spy in a camp where his enemies saw him as invisible. The very hatred that made them treat him as less than human had become his greatest advantage. Outside, the guards continued their conversation, never suspecting that the black man shoveling coal could understand every treasonous word. The fist came out of the darkness and caught Elijah across the jaw before he could raise his hands. He hit the barracks floor hard, tasting blood, and looked up to see Jerome Washington standing over him with fury burning in his eyes. "You think we don't see you?" Jerome hissed, sneaking around, whispering with that white captain. "You selling us out? You their pet now." Elijah could have explained. He could have revealed everything. Instead, he stayed silent because the fewer men who knew his secret, the fewer men could break under torture. Before Jerome could swing again, a massive hand caught his arm. Sergeant Thomas Booker, everyone called him Big Tom, pulled Jerome back with the casual strength of a man who had spent 20 years loading freight in Alabama. "That's enough," Big Tom said. "Whatever you think you know, you don't." Jerome struggled, but Big Tom held him firm. "He's playing both sides. I've seen his type before." "You've never seen his type," Big Tom replied. "None of us have. Now get some sleep before you do something that gets us all killed." After Jerome stalked away, Big Tom helped Elijah to his feet. The big sergeant's eyes were knowing. "Captain Davenport told me what you're doing. He figured you'd need protection. I didn't ask for protection. Didn't say you did. But you're going to get it anyway." By February, Elijah had mapped the entire camp in his head. He knew the patrol schedules, the supply routes, the names of every officer. He knew that the commandant, a man named Oberstfleischer, was skimming food supplies and selling them on the black market. He knew that the camp's radio operator was secretly listening to BBC broadcasts and sharing the news with sympathetic guards. He also knew about Hauptmann Friedrich Hecht. Hecht was different from the other officers. He was a former university professor who had once taught linguistics in Munich. The party had forced him out when he refused to join, and he had clawed his way back into favor through brutal efficiency. Now he served as the camp's security officer, and unlike the others, he watched the prisoners with intelligent eyes. One afternoon, during a work detail in the officers' quarters, Hecht cornered Elijah in a hallway. The captain stood close, speaking in rapid, scholarly German, quoting Goethe, testing him. Elijah kept his expression blank. He tilted his head as if confused by the strange sounds. Hecht smiled coldly. "You are not what you pretend to be. I have not yet discovered what you are, but I will." That night, Elijah could not sleep. He had been careful, so careful. But Hecht was not like the guards who saw black skin and assumed ignorance. Hecht saw patterns. Hecht asked questions. The next morning brought worse news. During his coal-shoveling detail, Elijah overheard two guards discussing a directive from Berlin. The war was clearly lost. Allied forces were crossing the Rhine, but the SS had ordered that certain prisoners were never to be liberated. Jews, political prisoners, and in some camps, non-Aryan soldiers. "They want the Schwarzen eliminated before the Americans arrive," one guard said, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. "Made it look like a bombing raid. Unfortunate casualties of war." Elijah's shovel froze mid-swing. He forced himself to continue the motion, to keep his face empty, but his heart was pounding so hard he was certain the guards could hear it. That evening, he found Captain Davenport in the latrine, the only place they could speak without being observed. "They're going to kill us," Elijah said, his voice barely above a whisper. "All the black prisoners. Before liberation. They're going to make it look like an accident." Davenport's face went pale. "How long do we have?" "Weeks. Maybe less." The guards are nervous. They know the Americans are close. Some of them want to surrender. But the SS loyalists are pushing for blood. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Outside, they could hear the distant rumble of artillery, American guns, drawing closer each day. "Then we need to move faster," Davenport finally said. "We need allies inside this camp. German allies." "There's a woman," Elijah said slowly. "A civilian who works in a laundry. I think she hates them as much as we do. A German woman helping American prisoners. Her husband died on the Eastern Front. The party took her home. She has nothing left to lose." Davenport studied Elijah's face in the dim light. "You understand what you're asking? If you're wrong about her, if she reports you, they won't just kill you. They'll make an example." Elijah thought of his grandmother, who had survived decades of American racism through careful observation and quiet resilience. She had taught him that survival required reading people, understanding who could be trusted and who could not. I'm not wrong, he said. The next morning, he left a note in the laundry pile. 3 words in German. Can you help? The day after, he found his answer tucked inside a folded shirt. 2 words. Tell me how. American artillery shook the earth 3 miles away, and Elijah Greer stood in the center of the assembly yard with 800 prisoners watching him do something that should have been impossible. He was speaking German. The words flowed from his mouth with the precision of a professor, the confidence of a man who had nothing left to lose. He addressed the camp commandant directly, his voice carrying across the frozen yard where guards stood with rifles ready and prisoners stood with hearts pounding. Herr Oberst Fleischer, your radio operator has been tracking the American advance. I know this because I have listened to your officers discuss it for 3 months. The Third Army is 48 hours away, perhaps less. Every prisoner in this camp has been documented by the Red Cross. Every face photographed, every name recorded. If we die before liberation, there will be no confusion about who killed us. The silence was absolute. Guards who had spent months spitting on Elijah, kicking him, calling him an animal. They stood frozen, their mouths open, unable to process what they were witnessing. The black laborer they had dismissed as subhuman was speaking their language better than some of them could. Commandant Fleischer's hand moved toward his pistol. Elijah did not flinch. You can shoot me, Herr Oberst. It will change nothing. The Americans will arrive. They'll find bodies, and they will find witnesses who will testify to exactly what happened. You will hang, or you can choose differently. You could be the officer who protected prisoners in the final days. The officer who showed mercy when others did not. The moment stretched. Elijah could feel the weight of every eye in the camp. Prisoners who did not know whether to hope, guards who did not know whether to shoot. Behind the commandant, Hauptmann Hecht stood with an unreadable expression. The security officer who had suspected Elijah for months was watching his suspicions confirmed. Then Hecht moved that he stepped forward and placed his hand on Fleischer's arm. Not aggressively, but firmly. The prisoner makes a valid point, Herr Oberst. Perhaps we should discuss this inside. Fleischer stared at Hecht with a mixture of fury and confusion. You're siding with the enemy? I'm siding with survival. Yours and mine. The 2 officers retreated to the commandant's office. The assembly was dismissed, and Elijah was dragged into a storage room by guards who no longer knew what to do with him. He expected torture. He expected death. Instead, he found himself sitting across from Hecht in a bare concrete room with a single light bulb overhead. How long? Hecht asked in German. Since childhood. My grandmother worked for a German family in Ohio. You fooled everyone, even me, for a time. Hecht's voice carried something that might have been respect. The SS will want you dead. They have already ordered the elimination of non-Aryan prisoners. Fleischer has been stalling, but he cannot stall much longer. Then help me stop them. Hecht laughed, a bitter, exhausted sound. You think I have power here? I'm a former professor who was forced to become a soldier. I have survived this war by being useful, nothing more. You have enough power to have stopped Fleischer from shooting me today. The captain's eyes narrowed. That was self-preservation. If you died in front of witnesses, there would be consequences when the Americans arrived. I prefer to avoid consequences. Then help us take control of the camp. Help us keep the SS from massacring prisoners before liberation. When the Americans arrive, I will tell them you helped. I will tell them you were never a true believer. And why would they believe a black prisoner speaking on behalf of a German officer? Elijah leaned forward. Because I speak German. Because I have spent 3 months gathering intelligence on every officer in this camp. And because Captain Davenport will confirm everything I say. He's a white officer from Virginia. They'll believe him even if they won't believe me. Hecht was silent for a long moment. Outside, artillery rumbled again, closer now. The SS have taken hostages, Hecht finally said. They're barricaded in the east compound with 30 prisoners. They intend to execute them at the first sign of American tanks. There's a civilian woman among them. A laundry worker they suspected of passing information to prisoners. Elijah's blood went cold. Marta, they had found her. I need to get into that compound, he said. They'll kill you the moment they see you. Not if I go under a white flag. Not if I give them an alternative. Hecht studied him with the analytical gaze of a man who had spent his life evaluating texts and arguments. You would risk your life for prisoners who mean nothing to you. Elijah thought of his grandmother, who had spent her life serving people who never saw her as human. He thought of the black soldiers who had died in the snow at Worth, massacred by SS troops who considered them unworthy of the Geneva Convention. He thought of every indignity he had suffered, every moment of invisibility, every time he had bitten his tongue and bowed his head. They mean everything to me, he said. Every single one of them. Hecht rose and moved toward the door. He paused with his hand on the handle. There's a gap in the eastern fence. The SS don't know about it. If someone were to approach from the north, carrying a white flag, the barricaded soldiers might hesitate before shooting. They're young, scared. They might listen, and if they don't, Hecht opened the door. Then you will have died doing something that mattered. That is more than most men can say. Elijah walked out into the fading light. Across the camp, the east compound waited. The white flag in Elijah's hand was a torn bedsheet, and the gap in the fence was barely wide enough for his shoulders. He crawled through on his belly, feeling the frozen earth scrape against his chest, and emerged into the no-man's land between compounds as the last light of day bled from the sky. The SS soldiers saw him immediately. Rifles swung toward his chest. A young voice screamed for him to halt. Elijah rose slowly, keeping the flag high. He walked forward with measured steps, his heart hammering against his ribs. 20 yards. 15. 10. I am unarmed, he called out in German. I am here to negotiate. The soldier who stepped forward from the barricade was barely 19, his face gaunt with exhaustion and fear. His uniform bore the insignia of the Waffen-SS, but his hands trembled on his rifle. There is nothing to negotiate, the young man said. The Americans will not take us alive. We will die as soldiers. You will die as murderers, Elijah replied calmly. If you execute those hostages, every man behind that barricade will hang. But if you surrender now, if you release the prisoners unharmed, you have a chance. The Americans want the war to end. They are not looking for blood. Why should I believe you? You are one of them. A prisoner. I am a prisoner who speaks German. I am a prisoner who has watched your officers for 3 months. I know that Unteroffizier Brandt has a sister in Munich. I know that Schütze Lehmann was a school teacher before the draft took him. These are men with families, with futures. Don't let the dead-enders rob them of that. The young soldier's eyes flickered. Behind him, Elijah could see movement, other SS men shifting, whispering. They were weighing their options. They were scared. Then a door opened in the compound, and Marta Vogel stumbled out with a rifle pressed to her back. She was thinner than Elijah remembered, her face bruised, her clothes torn. But her eyes met his with fierce recognition. She had known he would come, the SS officer behind her. An Unterscharfer with dead eyes and a dueling scar pressed the rifle harder against her spine. One more step, and the traitor dies first. Elijah stopped moving. She is not your enemy. She lost her husband to this war. She has suffered as much as any of you. She passed information to prisoners. That is treason. She passed newspapers. Words on paper. Is that worth dying for? From the distance came the unmistakable rumble of tank treads. American armor grinding closer. The ground itself seemed to vibrate with approaching liberation. The Unterscharfer's face contorted. They're coming. We're out of time. Then make your choice, Elijah said. Die in the next hour for a Reich that has already fallen, or live to see your families again. Every man behind that barricade has the same choice. Every single one. For a long moment, no one moved. The tanks grew louder. The sky darkened. Somewhere in the main camp, prisoners were gathering at the fences, watching, waiting. Then Schütze Lehmann, the former schoolteacher, lowered his rifle. Enough, he said quietly. I won't die for this. Another rifle lowered. Then another. The young soldier at the front looked at his comrades, saw the tide turning, and slowly stepped aside. The Unterscharfer screamed with rage. He swung his rifle toward Elijah, but before he could fire, Big Tom Booker came through the gap in the fence like a freight train, tackling the officer to the ground. The rifle discharged into the air. By the time the echo faded, it was over. American tanks rolled through the camp gates at dawn. Elijah stood with the freed hostages, Marta beside him, Big Tom behind him, Captain Davenport approaching with the first American officers. "This man," Davenport said, pointing to Elijah, "is the reason any of us are alive. He gathered intelligence for months. He negotiated the release of hostages. He should be decorated." The American colonel looked at Elijah, a black private in a torn uniform, standing amid the ruins of a German prison camp. The colonel's expression was unreadable. "We'll file the appropriate paperwork," he said finally. "There are procedures." Elijah understood. There would be no parade, no ceremony. The army that had segregated him, that had sent him to war in separate units and denied him the dignity afforded to white soldiers, would not suddenly celebrate his heroism. That was not how America worked, but he was alive. Marta was alive. The men who would have died in that compound were alive. 2 months later, Elijah sailed home on a transport ship crowded with returning soldiers. He disembarked in New York Harbor, passed through a processing center that separated white veterans from black ones, and boarded a train for Cincinnati. His grandmother's house was exactly as he remembered, small, weathered, standing at the edge of the German neighborhood where she had spent her life serving others. She had died while he was overseas, the neighbors told him, peacefully, in her sleep. Elijah stood at her grave in the spring rain and spoke to her in German. He told her about the camp, about Marta, about the moment he had stepped forward and spoken the language she had given him, the language that had saved his life and the lives of so many others. He told her that the guards had frozen when they heard him speak, that for one impossible moment, the hatred that had made them see him as subhuman had shattered like ice. And he told her that he was home now, that he would find a way to live in a country that still did not see him as equal, that the fight was not over. It never was, but he would keep fighting, in her language, in his own voice, until the walls fell everywhere.